In a laboratory illuminated by an eerie glow, the professor is deeply engrossed in his temporal reversal experiment. Accompanied by students, he embarks on a journey through time, driven by the desire to prevent a tragedy from 30 years prior to suicide of his beloved. However, as the truth begins to unravel, the youthful professor is revealed to be none other than himself, entangled in a web of betrayal and redemption, while the relentless current of history threatens to consume everything. Can traversing time alter fate? The secrets buried by the passage of time shall ultimately be unveiled beneath the moonlight. 1. The laboratory's white light. Gao Ping, come down quickly, shouted a fellow student from the floor below. Gao Ping responded promptly, turning off the last oscilloscope and surveying the laboratory before stepping outside. Today marked the final class of the day, which happened to be a lab session, and it was his turn to take duty. Once he tidied up, the entire building stood desolate. With the clock nearing 5 o'clock, he realized that if he did not hurry to the cafeteria, he would likely go hungry for dinner. The curtains were drawn, casting a dimness over the room. Gao Ping closed the door and hurried down the stairs. The laboratory was situated on the 5th floor, devoid of an elevator, and by the time he burst through the entrance, he was slightly out of breath. Upon exiting, his classmate called, "Gao Ping, why didn't you bring your book?" Gao Ping paused, suddenly aware of his empty hands in his haste. He had forgotten to grab it. "Wait for me a moment, I'll go retrieve it," he replied. "Don't bother. If you wait any longer, there won't be anything left to eat. Just go have dinner first, and you can come back for it afterward." The cafeteria at the university was humorously referred to as the feeding ground by students. The food was subpar, and with thousands of students, there was only a modest cafeteria. Each mealtime felt akin to a revolution, as students surged in like the Red Guards storming the Winter Palace, devouring the dishes within mere minutes. Arriving late often meant only leftovers were available. By the time Gao Ping finished his meal amidst the chaos, it was already past 5:30 as the year drew to a close. Darkness descended early, and 5:30 found the world shrouded in twilight, the laboratory particularly dim. With no one else around, Gao Ping ascended to the 5th floor alone, the sound of his footsteps echoing hollowly. When an odd premonition struck him, it felt as if something significant was about to unfold. Upon reaching the 5th floor, he retrieved his book from the laboratory and was about to descend when a sudden flash of light flickered down the corridor. The brilliance resembled that of an electric welder, blinding him momentarily. Had some instrument malfunctioned and caused an explosion? Though silence enveloped the scene, Gao Ping was nonetheless startled. The luminous phenomenon emanated from the neighboring high-energy physics laboratory, which housed an expensive particle accelerator. He rushed to the door of that laboratory and flung it open. Just as he did, a heart-wrenching scream pierced the air, muffled yet resonant, interspersed with the sound of shattering glass. Gao Ping called out, "Who is it? Who's inside?" As he pressed the switch located by the door, the light illuminated the room. Contrary to Gao Ping's expectation of chaos, it remained remarkably tidy, save for a few shards of glass scattered across the floor, likely remnants of a shattered cup. A figure lay motionless on the ground, beside which the power indicator of the particle accelerator still glowed, emitting a soft, persistent hum. The individual was sprawled face down, and Gao Ping approached, gently assisting him to an upright position. Upon recognizing the man's face, Gao Ping could not suppress a startled exclamation. "Professor Liu!" Professor Liu was the most eccentric figure in the academy, born abroad and a graduate of Princeton University. It was rumored that he had once encountered Einstein in his youth. After returning to his homeland, he devoted himself to teaching at the academy. In his younger days, he was quite dashing, but during the Cultural Revolution, he faced severe injustices and endured considerable hardship. Although he later had his name cleared and regained his status, he had transformed into a disheveled old man, often silent and reclusive. He left class promptly, never having married and remaining single to this day. Gao Ping never imagined he would find him in such a predicament. He helped Professor Liu to a chair and inquired, "Are you all right, Professor Liu?" Slowly, Professor Liu opened his eyes, tears suddenly streaming down his cheeks as he murmured, I was wrong. Confused and anxious, Gao Ping was at a loss for how to respond, fearing for the professor's well-being. He gently patted Liu's back, asking what happened. With a sigh, Professor Liu wiped away the tears from the corners of his eyes and glanced at Gao Ping. "Which class are you in?" "I am from the physics department. My name is Gao Ping, professor," he replied. Professor Liu gradually rose to his feet, surveyed the surroundings, and said, "It's nothing. Thank you. Let's go." He reached out to switch off the particle accelerator and walked toward the exit. Though Gao Ping was filled with questions, he dared not speak further and simply followed him outside. He did not share this incident with anyone. and it appeared that no one else was aware of it. For the following week, Gao Ping immersed himself in the library, diligently reviewing his studies and indulging in novels during his free time. Professor Liu taught 2 classes each week, addressing a large audience consisting of 3 different cohorts. As they crowded into the lecture hall, Gao Ping found it difficult to concentrate on the expressionless professor delivering his lecture. The 2 words spoken by Liu lingered persistently in his mind. What did Professor Liu mean by "I was wrong"? Could it be that he had been conducting an experiment that had gone awry? This thought conjured images of the mad scientists from the science fiction films he had seen. Those eccentric inventors often created strange and bizarre contraptions had he unwittingly stumbled into a similar scenario. Suddenly, the class bell rang, causing Professor Liu to abruptly cease speaking, gather his belongings, and exit. This was a hallmark of Liu. Once the bell rang, he would invariably leave without uttering another word. As Gao Ping observed the professor's slender silhouette retreating, an inexplicable chill coursed through him. What exactly is Professor Liu engaged in? If Monday through Friday constitutes a hellish ordeal for students, then Saturday is undoubtedly their paradise. Gao Ping is not one of those excessively diligent students, yet devoid of a girlfriend and any particular hobbies. He finds himself in the study room early on Saturday morning, preparing to peruse his textbooks and delve into a novel. This particular work is a translated science fiction tale, intriguingly centered around a story of a scientific monster, and the illustrations depict a scientist who bears a striking resemblance to Professor Liu. He cannot suppress a chuckle. Perhaps all scientific monsters appear thus: disheveled hair, gaunt physique, adorned with wide-rimmed spectacles, and eyes that exude a hint of madness. What if he were to resemble this in the future? He flips over a sheet of draft paper and sketches a portrait. Lacking any artistic skill, he merely draws for amusement, partially replicating the illustration. However, when he inadvertently draws the eyes, he is astonished to find that they bear a remarkable likeness to Professor Liu. A tumult of emotions swells within Gao Ping, prompting him to crumple the draft paper and cast it aside as he attempts to focus on his studies. Nevertheless, those eyes linger persistently in his mind, imbued with both madness and melancholy. After hastily completing some assignments, a dull ache settles in his head. He closes his books and steps out of the study room, seeking a stroll to clear his mind. On this Saturday, the campus is notably quieter than usual. Gao Ping circles the teaching building and arrives before the experimental building. He gazes upward, intending to leave, when unexpectedly, he notices a beam of light emanating from the laboratory. The source of the illumination is the high-energy physics laboratory on the 5th floor. Although the curtains in this lab are drawn, gaps remain, allowing the light to escape. Gao Ping halts, puzzled as he gazes upward. It is the weekend, and typically, the laboratory would be deserted, yet this beam of light cannot merely be a figment of his imagination. Approaching the entrance of the experimental building, he tentatively pushes the door. Usually, the doors are locked on weekends, but this one is merely ajar. Frowning slightly, he hesitates before stepping inside. The corridor is shrouded in darkness, with no lights illuminating the way. Each step he takes is laced with apprehension, fearing the sudden appearance of an instructor. Should a teacher confront him and inquire about his intentions, he would be at a loss for words. However, it seems that the building is empty this weekend, and he ascends the staircase slowly. The edges of the stairs are somewhat illuminated, but the light filtering through the glass windows creates a peculiar ambience, as if myriad tiny creatures are clamoring within, the rays producing a cacophony. Yet, Gao Ping recognizes this as merely his imagination, a product of the eerie tranquility surrounding him. The silence was profound, so much so that a persistent ringing echoed in Gao Ping's ears. Ascending to the 5th floor, he suddenly became acutely aware of the overwhelming stillness, and the ringing was, in fact, a genuine sound emanating from the high-energy physics laboratory. It must have originated from the small particle accelerator. Although this sophisticated apparatus was far too costly for an undergraduate like him to operate, he recognized the humming sound produced when the machine was activated. At that moment, an inexplicable thought of Professor Liu crossed his mind. Could it be Professor Liu? As Gao Ping approached the high-energy physics laboratory, he realized the sound was indeed coming from within. He gently pushed the door, only to find it locked from the inside. Leaning closer to the window, he peered inside, but the curtains were drawn tightly, obscuring his view. Just as he was about to look again, a sudden burst of light dazzled him. Despite the thick curtains, he was momentarily blinded by the brightness. Having never operated a particle accelerator, he was nonetheless aware that such a device would not emit such a radiant glow. As he pondered this, The door swung open unexpectedly. Professor Liu emerged from within. Although not particularly old, he appeared to have aged a decade in that moment. Perhaps the dim lighting of the laboratory had accentuated the gray in his hair. He clutched a flat cardboard box and staggered to the door, leaning against the frame, struggling to catch his breath as though he might collapse at any moment. Professor Liu. Gao Ping rushed forward to support him. As he grasped the professor's arm, Liu trembled and looked at him with a flicker of panic in his eyes. Uncertain of what troubled the professor, Gao Ping asked, "Are you all right?" Professor Liu felt as cold as ice, still shivering. Gao Ping suddenly noticed a damp patch on the professor's sleeve, speckled with white substances. As he leaned in for a closer look, the white particles melted into water. It was snow. Not only was there snow on Professor Liu's sleeve, but also in his hair, which explained the white appearance. A shiver ran down Gao Ping's spine. It was the end of the year, yet it had not snowed today, and there were no refrigeration units in the high-energy physics laboratory. Where could the snow have come from? Professor Liu managed to sit down, casting another glance at Gao Ping. "You're Gao Ping, are you not?" "Yes, I am Gao Ping, Professor," he replied. Liu brushed the snow from his hair and asked, "What did you see?" His voice carried a note of astonishment, tinged with concern. "I don't know," Gao Ping responded. "Professor, what experiment are you conducting?" Liu exhaled deeply and surveyed his surroundings. The particle accelerator had been shut down, and Gao Ping noticed a circular wet mark at the entrance to the laboratory, as if a damp cloth had just been placed there. Professor Liu also noticed that Gao Ping was focused on the damp mark. He said, "Let's go, it's nothing." Gao Ping's curiosity intensified as he approached the wet spot, crouching down to touch it with his fingers. The mark felt chilling, more akin to having touched a piece of ice. He lifted his head and asked, "What is this?" "It's nothing. Hurry up, I need to close the door," Professor Liu replied while standing up, mimicking the action of shutting the door. However, as he rose, he suddenly swayed, almost losing his balance. Gao Ping rushed forward to support him, saying, "Professor Liu, I know what you are doing." He intended this as a mere jest, but to his surprise, a glint of coldness flashed in Professor Liu's eyes. Startled, Gao Ping had yet to comprehend the situation when Liu's hand abruptly swung up, brandishing a cup with a speed and force unimaginable for an elderly man, aiming it at his head. Point 3. Relativity is also relative. Gao Ping struggled to open his eyes, which were still swirling with spots of gold. For a moment, he was bewildered about what had transpired, his head throbbing as though it might split apart. Just as he attempted to sit up, a hand rested on his shoulder, and Professor Liu's voice softly whispered in his ear, "Are you all right?" In an instant, the events that had just unfolded flooded back into his mind. Gao Ping shot up, exclaiming, "What are you doing?" The science fiction novel he had recently read featured a similar scenario, where the protagonist, upon discovering the mad scientist's scheme, was also knocked unconscious, only to awaken bound like a lab rat, ready for experimentation. This was no fiction. If Professor Liu were indeed a mad scientist, he was certainly not as fortunate as the protagonist to escape at the last moment. Yet, he found himself not bound, but merely lying flat on the table. He touched his head, discovering a damp objecta, wet tissue adhered to his skin. Removing it revealed traces of blood. That was the wound inflicted by Professor Liu. As he looked at Liu, he had yet to say a word when Liu, visibly uneasy, rubbed his hands together and said, "I'm truly sorry I was too impulsive." This demeanor hardly resembled that of a mad scientist. Although Gao Ping was seething with anger, the sight of Professor Liu's anxious expression quelled his rage. He jumped off the table and pressed the tissue against his wound. Fortunately, the bleeding had ceased, indicating that the injury was not severe. Disposing of the wet tissue in the trash, he asked, "Professor Liu, what on earth are you doing?" Professor Liu, perhaps still feeling guilty, dared not meet Gao Ping's gaze, focusing instead on his feet as he murmured, "I am conducting an experiment, one that the school would not approve." He paused before adding, "But it is a truly remarkable experiment." What kind of experiment? Gao Ping was no longer particularly interested in the experiment. He simply wished to leave the laboratory as soon as possible. The door was still ajar, and if he could escape, Professor Liu would likely be unable to pursue him, as long as he didn't reveal his intentions. Just as he prepared to bolt, Professor Liu suddenly declared, "Time reversal." Had Gao Ping not heard clearly, he would have dashed out of the laboratory. Yet those 4 words seemed to possess an enchanting power, rendering him motionless. Stammering, he asked, "What do you mean, time reversal?" Professor Liu reiterated, "Nonsense, that is impossible." The fundamentals of relativity had been taught in high school. Gao Ping recalled that his physics teacher had once declared that relativity proved the impossibility of time travel. Was Professor Liu losing his mind? He scrutinized the professor, who appeared dejected, perhaps regretting having struck himself moments ago, yet there was no hint of madness in his demeanor. Hearing Gao Ping's words, Professor Liu lifted his head and smiled faintly. Indeed, if relativity is the truth, then it is certainly impossible. Gao Ping was taken aback. What? Have you disproved relativity? He had lost all desire to leave, eager instead to hear Professor Liu's explanation. Please sit down, this is a lengthy discourse. As he spoke, Professor Liu pulled a chair closer and sat down. Gao Ping, as if attending a class, followed suit and took a seat opposite the professor. Instinctively reaching for his notebook, he realized he had grasped nothing but air, reminding himself that this was not a lecture. He nodded in acknowledgement. Yes, absolute zero is the theoretical lower limit of temperature. In his youth, he had imagined that temperatures could descend infinitely low, yet later, upon studying physics, he learned that irrespective of how low the temperature drops, the same applies to speed. The speed of light is termed absolute speed, as nothing has ever been observed to exceed if this speed is approximately 300,000 kilometers per second. Gao Ping interjected. Professor Liu nodded. That is generally correct, though the actual speed is slightly less. However, for everyday calculations, this approximation suffices. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, the gravitational force between objects is a variable related to both their speeds and masses. Yes, we learned that in high school. Yet, in our typical calculations, we invariably employ Newton's law of universal gravitation without accounting for the object's speeds. Why is that? Gao Ping replied, because the ratio of an object's speed to the speed of light is exceedingly minute and can be disregarded. Precisely. Liu's fingers tapped lightly on the table. There is a critical flaw in the relativity formula. When an object's speed surpasses that of light, the formula fails to provide an explanation. But no object can exceed the speed of light. As he uttered this, he noticed a glimmer of amusement at the corner of Professor Liu's mouth, prompting him to inquire, Professor Liu, have you discovered an error in relativity? Professor Liu rose and pointed to a damp mark. Indeed, it is here. The damp mark had nearly dried, now almost imperceptible. Gao Ping looked at it, still perplexed about its relevance to relativity. What exactly is this? However, Professor Liu seemed not to have heard his question and murmured. In the early 20th century, people regarded universal gravitation as an unassailable truth, and when Einstein proposed relativity, many opposed him. Yet ultimately, people accepted relativity, for it is closer to the truth. The universal gravitation formula is merely an approximation of relativity when the influence of speed is neglected. Closer? Closer, Professor Liu reiterated. Since the universal gravitation formula is merely an approximation, relativity itself is also relative. Point 4. The possibility of surpassing the speed of light. Impossible. Gao Ping exclaimed abruptly, momentarily forgetting his surroundings. What kind of logic is this? Gravitational force is relative. So must relativity also be relative? At that moment, a voice called from outside. Who is it? Who's upstairs? The tone was harsh, belonging to a janitor. Professor Liu picked up a nearby cardboard box and said, let us depart. I will explain everything at my home. He approached the door and called out, is that you, Oljung? It's me. We will leave shortly. As Gao Ping and Professor Liu descended the stairs, the janitor, Oljung, remained watchful in the corridor. Upon seeing Professor Liu, he visibly relaxed and remarked, Professor Liu, it's you. Have you finished? I need to close the door. Oljung had been at the academy for decades, his tenure surpassing even that of the current dean, and the younger faculty members regarded him with a degree of apprehension. Yes, we shall depart at once, Professor Liu replied casually, just as he was about to continue down the stairs when Oljung suddenly interjected, Professor Liu, do not dwell too much on the past. What has transpired is behind us. Oljung's unexpected philosophical utterance took Gao Ping by surprise. Professor Liu paused, turned, and replied, some matters are simply unforgettable. Oljung sighed, clutching his mop, and without further comment, ascended the stairs. Professor Liu's residence was located within the academy, sharing the same staff building as the younger, single instructors. However, due to his advanced age, he had a private room, unlike those teachers who had to share accommodations. Upon entering, Professor Liu set the cardboard box down beside the table and gestured, please have a seat, while rummaging through a drawer. Gao Ping surveyed the surroundings surprisingly. Professor Liu's home bore no semblance to that of a mad scientist. Although sparsely furnished, it was tidy, with 3 of the 4 walls lined with books. By the window stood a writing desk, and to Gao Ping's astonishment, there lay a photograph of a woman. The photograph was in black and white, suggesting it was quite old, possibly over 30 years. At that time, Professor Liu must have been a young man in his 30s. Perhaps this was a photograph of his former girlfriend, yet Gao Ping found it difficult to envision this aloof professor as a romantic entity that moment. Professor Liu extracted a band-aid and tossed it in front of Gao Ping, saying, "Here, apply this." Gao Ping tore open the band-aid and affixed it to his wound. The injury was minor. The bleeding had long ceased in reality. It was of little concern. Once he had finished, he could no longer contain his curiosity and asked, "Professor Liu, have you discovered a material that surpasses the speed of light?" This query had lingered in his mind, but when Professor Liu nodded, Gao Ping was taken aback. "What is it?" he inquired, struggling to comprehend the implications of exceeding the speed of light. Supersonic speed requires breaking the sound barrier. Does superluminal speed necessitate breaching the light barrier? What occurs in a state beyond the speed of light? These concepts were beyond the scope of his understanding. He cautiously suggested, could it be that particles exceeding the speed of light were obtained in a particle accelerator? Certainly, not such matters cannot be elucidated in a fleeting moment. Professor Liu seemed reluctant to elaborate further that a particle accelerator can only achieve subliminal particles. However, through this field matter converter, one can attain superluminal speeds. Field matter conversion. Gao Ping was once again taken aback. This was yet another theme commonly found in science fiction that he asked, have you truly invented a means to convert fields into matter? The theoretical feasibility of converting energy fields into matter has long been acknowledged, yet no one has ever succeeded. Some speculate that the Tunguska event in the early 20th century was triggered by a cosmic ray striking Earth, its immense energy morphing into matter, though conclusive. Evidence remains elusive, thus rendering it unverified. Professor Liu nodded, stating, once particles are accelerated beyond the speed of light, they convert into a field. Wait a moment. Gao Ping felt his mind swirling into a chaotic mess. You previously mentioned that particles must pass through the field matter converter to attain superluminal speeds. How can they convert into a field only after surpassing the speed of light? Professor Liu chuckled. Are you familiar with Einstein's theory of time dilation? Indeed. Einstein introduced a gamma factor, stating that as speed increases, the gamma factor also rises, inversely relating to the time experienced by the object. Precisely. Professor Liu produced a pen and inscribed a formula. Gamma equals the square root of 1 minus the velocity squared divided by the speed of light squared. In this formula, velocity cannot exceed the speed of light otherwise. The gamma factor becomes an imaginary number, devoid of meaning. This is a derivation of the relativistic formula. Simply put, as speed increases, time slows down. When you approach the speed of light, time nearly comes to a standstill. Indeed. However, if speeds could genuinely exceed that of light, what would that imply? Professor Liu's eyes sparkled with intensity. Imaginary numbers are not without significance. They indicate that matter has already transformed into a field prior to entering the field matter converter. If matter becomes a field before passing through the converter, what purpose does the converter serve? Because after traversing the converter, its time flows backward. Gao Ping finally teetered on the brink of collapse, staring blankly at the earnest Professor Liu before erupting into a fit of laughter. Superluminal speeds, field matter conversion, time reversal. These terms, typically reserved for the realm of science fiction, sounded ludicrous when uttered by Professor Liu. After a few chuckles, he recognized his own lack of decorum and remarked, so, time travel is indeed feasible? We could return to the past. His words carried a hint of mockery. Yet, Professor Liu merely nodded and replied, yes. He paused before adding, I've already rendered it practical. 5. A love from 30 years ago returning to the past. Such an astonishing concept. Gao Ping often mused during his childhood about what it would be like if one could indeed traverse back in time, yet it remained merely a fanciful notion. Professor Liu's utterance left him speechless as he gazed at the professor, uncertain whether Liu was mad or merely deceiving himself. Professor Liu picked up a photograph of a woman from the table and murmured, You don't believe me? I knew you wouldn't. Gao Ping stood up and said, Professor Liu, it's time for lunch. If there's nothing else, I shall take my leave. Go on, Professor Liu replied, not even glancing at him, but you must not speak of this to anyone. During lunch, several classmates noticed a band-aid on Gao Ping's forehead and inquired about his injury. Fights occurred frequently at school, yet Gao Ping had never participated in such altercations. The sight of him, typically the peacemaker, now bearing a wound, naturally astonished them. Gao Ping hastily fabricated an excuse to deflect their curiosity, and they accepted it without suspicion. Had it not been for Professor Liu's guilt over having struck him, he likely would not have confided in him at all. Gao Ping pondered silently while washing the dishes. Yet, was what he claimed true or false? Although he often struggled to believe it, he found himself, almost unwittingly, inclined to accept that Professor Liu was indeed speaking the truth. The damp stain and the snow clinging to Professor Liu, these phenomena defied explanation. Perhaps, just perhaps, Professor Liu had truly invented a machine to return to the past. After washing the dishes, he placed the utensils in the cupboard. As he stepped outside, he noticed a group of classmates gathered around a notice at the door, discussing something animatedly. Assuming there was some sort of incident, he pushed forward to take a look, only to find a bulletin issued by the dean that IT stated that there had been a significant increase in electricity usage over the past month, with substantial surges in both the teaching and laboratory buildings. Consequently, the use of electric heating appliances by students was once again strictly prohibited. With the cold weather and the absence of heating devices provided by the school, students resorted to various means to keep warm in the dormitories, employing electric stoves, electric cups, and instant heaters. The school had replaced the fuses in the dormitory buildings with thinner ones, so that using an electric stove would invariably lead to a blown fuse. Yet, unexpectedly, students had found ways to use electric heating devices in the teaching and laboratory buildings as well, which was quite unforeseen. Days passed, and it was once again time for Professor Liu's class. When he entered, punctuated by the ringing of the bell, Gao Ping was taken aback. In merely a few days, Professor Liu appeared to have aged considerably, swaying slightly as he stood at the podium. Was he still conducting that experiment? Had he truly returned to the past? As Gao Ping sat in class, lost in his thoughts, a sudden scream from a student in the front row jolted him back to reality. Professor Liu had swayed and collapsed against the podium. Chaos erupted in the classroom, rendering the lesson impossible to continue. After school, many students were discussing Professor Liu's recent fainting episode. Gao Ping overheard some well-informed students mentioning that Professor Liu was quite frail, yet not suffering from any specific illness. Rather, he was simply exhausted. As for the reasons behind his fatigue, opinions varied widely. One particularly foul-mouthed student even claimed that Professor Liu was engaging in immoral activities daily, which was quickly refuted by others, as many had seen him diligently immersed in the laboratory, rarely even leaving campus. Gao Ping was almost certain that Professor Liu was engrossed in that particular experiment. After dinner, he spent some time studying in the self-study room, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of this matter. Once he completed his assignments, he exited the classroom and made his way to the faculty building. Upon reaching Professor Liu's doorstep, Gao Ping mustered his courage and knocked. He heard Professor Liu's voice from within, inviting him in, saying the door was unlocked. Pushing the door open, he found Professor Liu leaning against the bedside, gazing at a photograph. Clearly startled by Gao Ping's arrival, the professor exclaimed, "Gao Ping, what brings you here?" Gao Ping gently closed the door and sat beside the professor's bed, whispering, "Professor Liu, are you conducting an experiment on time travel?" Professor Liu glanced around to ensure privacy. The curtains were drawn tightly. He replied, "Please close the door completely before we continue." Gao Ping complied and returned to his seat by the bed. By this time, Professor Liu had sat up, looking intently at Gao Ping, asking, "Do you believe it now?" Gao Ping nodded, admitting, "While I cannot fully believe it, I am convinced that you are indeed still conducting experiments, which is likely the reason for your fainting today." With a heavy sigh, Professor Liu lamented, "I am getting old. I am no longer of any use." His sigh was laden with profound resignation. Will life truly restart if one returns to the past? Professor Liu smiled faintly. Of course not. Time travel is fundamentally akin to spatial travel. Both involve a change in coordinates, albeit one occurs in three-dimensional space while the other transpires in four-dimensional space. Why is it so imperative for you to return to the past? Professor Liu fell silent, his gaze fixed on Gao Ping, who felt a shiver under the intensity of that look. Uncertain of how to respond, Gao Ping was taken aback when Professor Liu suddenly asked, "Do you have a girlfriend?" Many students in the academy were already in relationships, yet Gao Ping was not. He found the question perplexing and awkwardly replied, "I haven't found one yet." Thus, you remain unaware of the immense power of human emotions, Professor Liu sighed, picking up the photograph beside him. For decades, if it weren't for this aspiration, I fear I would not have lived to see today. Gao Ping took the photograph in hand. The woman in the image was strikingly beautiful. Although it was a black and white photograph, her eyes sparkled with life as if they could speak. He inquired, "Who is she?" In a subdued tone, Professor Liu replied, "At that time, I was just over 30. During the anti-rightist movement, I was labeled a rightist, cast aside like refuse, shunned by all. except for her, who still came to comfort me. His eyes were filled with a distant gaze, lost in the reverie of memories. Though Gao Ping had yet to be born 30 years ago, he was aware of the historical context, understanding the ramifications of being branded a rightist. This woman must have been his girlfriend. He asked, "Where is she now?" Regretting the question immediately, he realized that Professor Liu's urgent desire to return to the past likely indicated that she had long since passed away. Professor Liu remained silent for a moment before suddenly grasping his hand and saying, "Gao Ping, I returned yesterday and saw her, but I cannot do this alone. Please accompany me." Returning to the past still relies on the transformation of field matter. Professor Liu said little, merely setting down the cardboard box beneath his arm. As long as one stands before it a second time, the transformation of field matter will be triggered, allowing us to return. Gao Ping felt a twinge of unease. Sneaking into the experimental building under the cover of night felt rather akin to thievery. When Professor Liu opened the door, he whispered, "Professor Liu, why come at night? Can't it wait a few days?" Professor Liu glanced at the sky and replied, "It is still the 16th. The transformation of field matter must depend on the moon's gravitational pull. Besides, the experimental building will have a power outage every night next week, and we shall have no further opportunity." Gao Ping was taken aback. "Isn't that a bit unreliable?" "Fairly reliable." Professor Liu turned to look at Gao Ping. "Are you afraid?" Gao Ping chuckled nervously. "Of course not." Yet, despite his desire to revisit the past, to claim he was unafraid would be disingenuous. "It's all right. As long as you assist me with this task, I shall ensure you are directly promoted to graduate student." Gao Ping chuckled again. He had never considered such an advancement. Professor Liu spoke as if it were a mere exchange. Upon opening the door, the two crept upstairs. When they reached the high-energy physics laboratory, he hesitated once more and asked, "Professor Liu, if we go, how do we return?" "Again, we rely on the transformation of field matter to come back." Professor Liu said nothing further, placing the cardboard box down. "Simply stand before it a second time, and the transformation will be activated, allowing us to return." Unlike the high-tech jargon of imagined field matter transformation, it was merely a disk surrounded by several cylindrical tubes, not tall, just reaching the ankles, and the disk itself was not large. With a diameter of about 1 meter, Professor Liu connected this disk to the particle accelerator. Gao Ping inquired, "Is this truly the transformation of field matter? What if a fly enters?" Professor Liu, evidently unfamiliar with the fly, replied, "What? If a fly enters with you, will my molecules intermingle with the flies, resulting in a monstrous hybrid? You've read too much science fiction. The transformation of matter and field is reversible. If a fly were to land on you, when you transition from field to matter, it would still be a fly on you." He added, patting his clothing, "The same applies to clothes. I did not transform into a monster composed of fabric and flesh." Gao Ping felt slightly reassured. "Then what should I do?" "Step inside. I will send you off and return immediately." Gao Ping stepped onto the disk, taking a deep breath. Soon, he would be inhaling the air from his origin. A thought that felt rather strange. He heard Professor Liu ask, "Are you ready? I do not wish for any part of your body to remain here while another part travels 30 years into the past." Gao Ping glanced around. The 1-meter diameter disc was ample enough to accommodate anyone who was not overly hefty. Exhaling, he replied, "All right." Professor Liu activated the particle accelerator, and the tubes beneath the disc suddenly illuminated, their brightness steadily increasing. Perhaps it was a mere fraction of a second, or perhaps even shorter. But the sudden flash of light was blinding, causing Gao Ping to involuntarily blink. It was an extraordinarily peculiar sensation, akin to the surge of acceleration experienced when an elevator first begins its ascent. Gao Ping felt an inexplicable lightness in his body, and when he opened his eyes again, he found himself momentarily disoriented. It quickly dawned on him what was causing his discomfort. It was daytime. Indeed, a bright, radiant day. The location remained that of the experimental building, yet the structure beneath his feet was in a state of disrepair, strewn with debris and shattered glass. The walls were scrawled with slogans in red paint, proclaiming calls for destruction and upheaval, and a large hole marred the roof, allowing snowflakes to drift inside. This was an era of madness, he mused. In novels and films, he had gleaned some knowledge of this tumultuous time. Yet he had never imagined he would experience it firsthand. Stepping out of the circular platform, he felt the thin layer of snow beneath his feet, leaving a few footprints as he walked. The snow of 30 years ago was not much different, perhaps just a shade whiter. In this era, pollution was likely less severe than in the time he called home. Just as he exited the circular platform, the tube beneath it suddenly illuminated, dazzling him momentarily. Turning his head, he beheld a figure emerging on the platform. Like a poorly focused photograph, the figure was initially indistinct, but soon its edges sharpened and brightened. And in the blink of an eye, Professor Liu materialized before him. "What year is it?" Gao Ping inquired. "January 13th, 1959, Liu replied briskly. Hurry, we have little time. The professor hurried down the stairs, and Gao Ping, slightly unsteady, followed closely. What are we to do? He asked. We must stop a man. Who? There is no time to explain. Come with me, Liu insisted, already outside the dilapidated building. The snow outside had accumulated more thickly, and the campus of 30 years ago bore a striking resemblance to that of 30 years hence, save for the slogans plastered everywhere and the posters of denunciation. Liu moved with remarkable speed, raising questions about his true age. Gao Ping followed him to the front of the gymnasium, which still stood, albeit in a much newer guise. The concrete retaining its grayish hue rather than the ochre he was accustomed to. Professor Liu paused by a window, peering through the broken panes. What is happening? Gao Ping asked. Shoo. Liu turned and pressed a finger to his lips. Keep your voice down. They are holding a struggle session inside. The gymnasium was packed with people, likely encompassing the entirety of the small academy, which Gao Ping remembered to have had no more than 3,000 or 4,000 students during his time, and perhaps even fewer than 1,000 in this era. At the front, some individuals occupied the podium, while several men donned tall hats. Clearly the so-called enemies of the state who had been dragged forth. Such scenes Gao Ping had only witnessed in films, yet now they unfolded vividly before his eyes. What are they doing? He whispered. They're holding a rally to denounce the rightists. Professor Liu did not look back, gripping the wall tightly, his body trembling slightly. Gao Ping stood behind him, peering inward. On the podium, a man in military attire proclaimed loudly, the great rightist Wang Haizhou, confess now or face annihilation. His voice, hoarse yet resonant, echoed ominously. The name Wang Haizhou struck Gao Ping like a dagger. The school's history had mentioned him as the founder of the institution, unjustly treated during the Cultural Revolution. Those words had seemed understated, but now Gao Ping grasped the full gravity of that injustice. The elderly man at the center must surely be Wang Haizhou. Gao Ping observed silently. The photograph of Director Wang in the school's history showed him vibrant and spirited upon his return to the country, yet now the old man hunched like a shrimp, his tall hat nearly brushing the ground. Shouts surged like waves, fists raised obscuring the figure of the elderly man. As the clamor subsided slightly, a girl's voice rose again, tinged with a sob, vaguely accusing Wang Haizhou of cruelly attacking the unscientific nature of the Great Leap Forward. After her outburst, a boy took the stage, echoing her sentiments with evident fervor, becoming increasingly agitated as he began to shove Wang Haizhou. The elderly man was pushed off balance, falling to the ground from the podium. At that moment, a girl's clear voice rang out, "Stop pushing." Gao Ping noticed a girl helping the fallen Wang Haizhou, whose tall hat had been knocked off, revealing a crimson mark on his head, likely from the fall. Just as Gao Ping was about to continue observing, Professor Liu suddenly grasped his arm and said, "Let us go." The professor's voice had grown weak, as if he had aged several years in an instant. Confused, Gao Ping followed him. Snow continued to fall, accumulating thicker on the ground, the air seemingly frozen in time. Professor Liu led him into the teaching building, instructing. To the rooftop. The rooftop was deserted. It was afternoon, and the view revealed a vast expanse of white. In this era, there were few tall buildings. The teaching block stood at a mere 5 stories, appearing strikingly out of place. Professor Liu surveyed the surroundings in silence. Gao Ping, struck by a sudden realization, asked, "Professor Liu, was it her?" The dim light of the gymnasium had obscured his view, yet he had surmised that the girl must be her. Professor Liu nodded. Suddenly, he turned and said, "Gao Ping, you must help me stop someone." "Stop whom?" Gao Ping inquired. "She will report her thoughts to the work propaganda team around 4 o'clock and will inform them that she criticized the Great Leap Forward and the anti-rightist campaign." Gao Ping pondered for a moment and replied, "What does it matter? What does it matter?" A flicker of pain appeared in Professor Liu's eyes. She too could become labeled a rightist, dragged onto the stage with Wang Haizhou for denunciation tomorrow, and then she. Professor Liu's voice faltered. A sudden chill gripped Gao Ping's heart. Then she will commit suicide? Professor Liu nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. Gao Ping felt a sharp pang in his heart as the image of the photograph on Professor Liu's desk resurfaced in his mind. That delicate, beautiful, yet fiercely resolute woman may have leapt from this very spot. You must stop him at all costs, Professor Liu said, lifting his head and wiping away the tears from his eyes with unwavering determination. Gao Ping nodded, yet an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. What were you doing at that time? He asked, immediately regretting his words. He was acutely aware that Professor Liu had already been branded as a rightist and was likely overwhelmed with his own troubles. Professor Liu gazed at the sky and sighed. What a wonderful woman she was. Her life should not have ended this way. Gao Ping, it is up to you now. This man is despicable. Even if you knock him unconscious, it is permissible. Very well, Gao Ping replied, albeit with a lingering sense of unease. He had never been in a fight before, And now he was expected to render someone unconscious, someone from 30 years ago, no less. He found the task daunting. After a moment's contemplation, he posed a question, Professor Liu. Why don't you stop him yourself? His inquiry seemed to strike Professor Liu like a bolt from the blue. He took a step back, leaned against the wall, and shook his head. No, I cannot do it. I cannot face him. He knows me. Gao Ping, I implore you, you must succeed. But do not kill him. Gao Ping chuckled lightly. Of course, I have no desire to become a murderer from 30 years ago. Professor Liu exhaled in relief. Let us wait here. He will arrive shortly. After you incapacitate him, we will return immediately. Gao Ping nodded, yet he still felt a sense of unease. By the way, Professor Liu, aren't we altering history by doing this? Could it affect our present time? Professor Liu replied with resolute conviction, no, it will not. Time is a unified continuum with a self-correcting mechanism. What we are doing is merely altering a specific process, but the outcome will remain unchanged, just like in the time machine. Gao Ping mumbled. He had seen that film, where the scientist repeatedly traveled back in time to save his fiancée, only to fail each time. As she inevitably met her tragic fate. It must be a spy. The snow continued to fall, enveloping everything in a gray haze. As dusk approached, the snowfall intensified, obscuring the view below from the rooftop. Gao Ping stood beneath the eaves, lost in thought as he gazed into the distance. Returning to this era, one that had yet to witness his existence, was something he had not contemplated until yesterday. No, even this morning. Yet here he stood, in a place he had never thought possible to reach. Everything felt surreal, yet undeniably tangible, leaving him in a dreamlike state. Can history truly be altered? If it were indeed like the time machine, even if he were to incapacitate this informant, it would not prevent the tragic end of that woman. Perhaps it was no wonder that ancient peoples lamented the inescapability of fate. If the future is truly immutable, then does that not imply the existence of destiny? Gao Ping's thoughts swirled like a chaotic blend of confusion, rendering him unable to discern any clarity. He shook his head, and Professor Liu, standing beside him, grasped him firmly and whispered, "They've arrived." There was a staircase on the rooftop, and they stood behind it. The temperature was dropping, and lights began to flicker in the distance, with only the soft sound of falling snow filling the air. Amidst this rustling reminiscent of silkworms devouring mulberry leaves, the footsteps of an individual gradually grew louder. Each step was heavy, indicating a deliberate pace. When the sound reached a wall that separated them, Gao Ping heard the door creak open. A figure emerged. Professor Liu nudged Gao Ping, urging him to cautiously peek out. The person had already reached the edge of the rooftop, leaning against the railing, lost in thought. Gao Ping pointed at the figure, but before he spoke, Professor Liu nodded without glancing. The individual stood with his back to them, an air of deep contemplation surrounding him. Gao Ping picked up a half-brick from the ground and slowly approached the figure. If he were to strike the person on the back of the head with the brick, he would surely be rendered unconscious. Yet, Gao Ping hesitated. He simply could not bring himself to commit such an act. As he took a couple of steps closer, just as he was about to raise the brick, a sudden sound caught his attention. The individual produced a soft crackle from his hand, and a spark of light flared up. He was striking a match to light a cigarette. The unexpected noise startled Gao Ping, who was already feeling guilty, causing him to drop the brick onto the snow-covered ground. The sound was muted, yet the figure turned abruptly, gazing at Gao Ping with surprise. "Who are you?" Despite wearing a simple jacket, Gao Ping appeared rather fashionable for that era, which likely explained the figure's bewilderment. Upon seeing the man, Gao Ping was further astonished. The individual was quite young, no more than in his early 30s. Yet, regardless of how one looked at him, he was unmistakably a younger version of Professor Liu. "Liu Professor," Gao Ping exclaimed, realizing the implications. The despicable man Professor Liu had spoken of was, in fact, himself. It was no wonder Professor Liu could not intervene. He had needed Gao Ping's assistance. The young Liu was momentarily taken aback, then replied with a wry smile, "I'm merely a lecturer, not a professor." "Do you know me? Which class are you from?" Gao Ping was uncertain how to respond. He swallowed hard and said, "Liu Professor, are you intending to report your thoughts to the workers' propaganda team?" The youthful Liu immediately became cautious. "What do you intend to do? How did you know?" "Don't go." Gao Ping stepped forward. "You will endanger your girlfriend." "Nonsense." The young Liu tossed away his cigarette. "If I don't report, I'll be denounced alongside Wang Haizhou tomorrow." He suddenly scrutinized Gao Ping, demanding, "Who exactly are you?" His gaze fell upon the half-brick on the ground, and he exclaimed, "Are you planning to hit me?" Gao Ping gritted his teeth and replied, "Indeed. If you refuse to heed my warning, I shall strike you unconscious." The young Liu flinched, discarded his cigarette, and resignedly said, "Fine." Gao Ping sighed with relief. He had not anticipated that persuading him would be so effortless. He said, "That's good. Otherwise, in the future," before he could finish, the young Professor Liu suddenly pounced like a leopard, his head colliding forcefully with his chest. Gao Ping staggered back and fell to the ground, the impact leaving him dazed. He had not anticipated that the young Professor Liu possessed such strength. As he struggled to rise, the young professor pressed him down, sneering, "Aha! You must be a spy. The work propaganda team must believe I have severed ties with the past now, haha." Gao Ping found it increasingly difficult to breathe as the young professor's grip tightened around his throat. The young professor's face began to blur before him. And despite his desperate attempts to pry away the iron grip, it felt as though he was caught in a vice. A sense of despair washed over him, mingled with a strange amusement at the thought of how the propaganda team would perceive him if they captured him, a supposed spy. In that moment of peril, a voice suddenly rang out, "Let him go." It was the voice of Liu Professor. Though not loud, it momentarily stunned the young professor, causing him to release his hold on Gao Ping. The young professor glared at Liu Professor, who had emerged from the stairwell, demanding, "Who are you?" Liu Professor smiled bitterly and replied, "I am you." The incredibility of this statement caused the young professor to retreat 2 steps, exclaiming, "Nonsense." Yet there was a tremor in his voice. Liu Professor lowered his head and murmured, "Do you really have to go?" The young professor, with a hint of madness in his eyes, shouted, "Of course I must. I must draw a clear line and sever all ties with the past." "Are you not afraid of future regret?" Liu Professor inquired. "What I have to regret? If I do not report, do I even have a future?" He laughed derisively. "Who on earth are you? Speak quickly." Pain etched itself deeper on Liu Professor's face as he coughed twice, responding, "I am you, and you are me. Stop babbling." The young professor suddenly leaped back. At that moment, his body was still agile, and he quickly bent down to pick up a half brick, hurling it fiercely at Liu Professor. Taken by surprise, Liu Professor was struck on the forehead and fell to the ground. Gao Ping, startled, jumped up and rushed to help Liu Professor, asking, "Professor Liu, are you all right?" Gasping, Liu Professor urged, "Quickly, stop him. He must report." Gao Ping felt utterly bewildered. Now, both were Professor Liu, and he did not know whose command to heed. This was history. If he truly prevented the young professor from proceeding, history would be irrevocably altered. In his hesitation, the young professor dashed to the stairwell, flinging open the door and preparing to descend. Liu Professor, drawing an unexpected surge of strength, shoved Gao Ping aside and charged after the young professor, surprisingly faster. He collided violently into the young professor's back, sending him staggering and tumbling down the stairs, letting out a chilling scream. Upon hearing that scream, Gao Ping felt a jolt of shock surge through him. He rushed over, intending to grasp the young Professor Liu. But it was too late. The young professor had already plummeted from the 5th floor to the hall on the 1st level, lying on the ground like a heap of discarded paper. "You killed him." Gao Ping gasped in shock. Perhaps it was an illusion, but he felt an intensified chill in the air. The snowflakes seemed to grow larger in that instant, cascading down like meteors, as if to bury the entire world beneath them. "Hurry," Professor Liu uttered weakly. Time was wavering. The future had shifted, and if they did not leave soon, it would be too late. Was the future truly changing? Gao Ping glanced around. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, resembling a thick fog. And the echo of the earlier scream lingered ominously. Trembling with fear, he urged, "Let us go." If the people of this era discovered their presence, he and Professor Liu would surely be branded as murderers. He noticed several individuals emerging downstairs, bewildered, speculating about the source of the scream. He helped Professor Liu descend, stumbling and disregarding the risk of falling. Upon reaching the ground level, he beheld the lifeless body on the floor. What would Professor Liu think upon witnessing his own corpse? He glanced at Liu, but the professor's expression was vacant, devoid of any discernible thoughts. Just as they exited the building, a group of students approached. Upon seeing them, one called out, "Hey, what happened?" Spotting the blood on Professor Liu's head, they likely assumed he was the source of the scream. "He is injured. I'm taking him to the infirmary," Gao Ping replied hastily, supporting Liu as they moved forward. The teaching building was shrouded in darkness. They could hardly discern what lay within. Yet, after only a few steps, they heard someone shout, "Professor Liu is dead. He is dead." They had discovered the young professor's body. A jolt of panic surged through Gao Ping as he urged Liu, "Let us go." Behind them, voices called out, "It must be those two. They are class enemies. Quickly, seize them." Ahead lay the dilapidated laboratory building. Gao Ping felt Liu growing increasingly feeble, nearly dragging him along. As they reached the hallway, he looked at Liu, who appeared as though in slumber, his eyes closed. "Professor Liu, we must hurry." Liu opened his eyes and stated, "History cannot be altered, but the future can be corrected." Even at this moment, he was discussing such academic matters. Gao Ping exclaimed, "If we don't leave now, we will be erased. You should go." "What? Are you planning to remain in this era?" Liu smiled bitterly. "Time has a self-repairing function. When changes occur, it makes corresponding adjustments to maintain the outcome. In your time, I no longer exist. You must leave." Gao Ping insisted, There is still time. Let us go together. It's too late, Liu murmured. Even the material converter will be gone. You must go, while the temporal fluctuations have yet to reach our era. Suddenly, Liu pushed Gao Ping forcefully. Gao Ping stumbled forward a few steps, but halted, frozen in place. Indeed, the current Professor Liu is a figure from 30 years hence. However, the youthful Professor Liu has long since passed away. So, who is this aged Professor Liu? Without him, the material transmutation apparatus could not possibly exist. Yet, how did I end up here? Gao Ping pondered laboriously, striving to untangle his thoughts. However, when the causes and effects intertwine, articulating the logical relationships becomes an insurmountable challenge. Observing Gao Ping still standing in a daze, Professor Liu called out, "Hurry." At that moment, a few swift students dashed to the entrance of the laboratory building. One of them shouting, "They are here. Come quickly, they are here." Gao Ping cast another glance at Professor Liu, seated on the steps, and abruptly turned around. Racing up the stairs, Gao Ping had once encountered a paradox stating that if a person were to travel back in time and kill their grandfather, then if the grandfather had already perished, the existence of that individual would be impossible, thus negating the ability to return and commit such an act. This paradox was employed to argue against the feasibility of time travel. However, Gao Ping now recognized the inherent flaw within the paradox itself. The present era and that of 30 years later could be perceived as two fixed points, with the intervening process resembling a line connecting these 2 points. When the starting point undergoes a transformation while the end point remains static, this line will inevitably experience fluctuations until a new equilibrium is established, a process overlooked by the paradox. Time was of the essence, and he could not afford to dwell on such thoughts any longer. He sprinted upwards, the material transmutation apparatus still present. Yet its edges appeared to be melting away, becoming increasingly indistinct. God, he must ascend before it vanishes. Gao Ping felt his heart racing violently, as if it might leap from his throat, while his lungs were continually constricted. He had to return. Only 5 steps remained. Snow continued to fall relentlessly, each flake heavy and cold as iron. 4 steps, 3 steps, 2 steps, 1 step. He lunged forward. The sound of the bell marked the finale. Professor Liu must have arrived just as the bell rang. When the bell chimed, several students were engaged in hushed conversations. Professor Liu was known as the most eccentric figure in the academy. It was said that he endured considerable suffering during the Cultural Revolution due to unjust treatment, which rendered him taciturn and solitary, leaving class promptly thereafter, never having married and remaining single to this day. As soon as class ended and the bell rang, Professor Liu would immediately seal his lips, gather his belongings, and exit. This was a hallmark of his character. Once the bell tolled, he would invariably depart without uttering a single word. After finishing his meal, Gao Ping completed his assignments and glanced out the window. The dean had ordered the disconnection of the laboratory building's fuse due to the escalating electricity costs, forbidding anyone from entering, thus rendering the building shrouded in darkness, appearing somewhat menacing in the twilight. Organizing his books, Gao Ping placed them into his backpack and exited the teaching building. As he walked along the path, he silently contemplated his thoughts. The wound on his forehead had healed, leaving no trace of a scar. After walking for a while, he suddenly came to a halt. Ahead lay the faculty building. Unlike the student dormitories, the faculty building remained illuminated even during power outages. After a moment's reflection, he decided to approach it. Professor Liu, having remained single, resides in the same faculty building as those younger teachers who share accommodations. However, due to his advanced age, he occupies a solitary room. Unlike the younger instructors who were compelled to share their quarters, Gao Ping approached Professor Liu's door and knocked gently. "Come in, the door is unlocked," came the reply from within. Professor Liu was seated at his desk, engrossed in a book. Upon noticing Gao Ping's entrance, he smiled and inquired, "What brings you here?" "Gao Ping? I have a question that I cannot comprehend," Gao Ping replied, producing his textbook to seek guidance. The professor's living space was immaculate, devoid of excessive furnishings, with books lining the walls and a black and white photograph gracing the desk. After elucidating his query, Professor Liu smiled and asked, "Is there anything else?" "Professor, may I hesitate to ask, but your surname was not originally Liu, was it?" Gao Ping ventured. Professor Liu raised an eyebrow, his expression darkening slightly. "How did you know?" He responded, a hint of disquiet in his voice. "My apologies," Gao Ping stammered, feeling somewhat uneasy. Professor Liu sighed and said, "It is of little consequence, really. It has been 30 years. This surname belongs to my late fiancée. At that time, the work propaganda team demanded that he denounce me, but he refused and chose to leap to his death. In his memory, I adopted the surname Liu." Gao Ping glanced at the photograph on the desk, which depicted a youthful Professor Liu, radiant and handsome. He bowed slightly and said, "I sincerely apologize, Professor Liu. I shall take my leave now," exiting the faculty building. He looked up at the sky, which was overcast and dreary. A somewhat waning crescent moon was obscured by the clouds. Professor Liu, he contemplated. The future may alter. Yet memories endure eternally.